It is the mid-18th century, on the shores of West Africa. Here lies the bustling port of Ouidah, on the slave coast. A mosaic of humanity. African traders in bright woven cloth haggle with Europeans over human lives, speaking in a cacophony of languages. Long caravans of captives, chained or yoked together, have arrived from the interior after weeks of marching. At the beach, European ships bob at anchor, their holds being filled with these enslaved Africans, destined for the New World. A dynamic, tragic, and complex scene, repeated at dozens of African ports for nearly 4 centuries. It is a scene that challenges the simplistic narrative that it was only the Europeans that orchestrated the slave trade, when in reality, the transatlantic slave trade was fueled by intricate African markets and networks, with African intermediaries and leaders playing pivotal roles, selling their own people. And so today, we travel to the slave markets of Africa that fueled the transatlantic slave trade. This exploration spans from the 15th century through to the 19th century and across the breadth of the African continent. Our focus today will be on the African side of this global enterprise, the local economies, political structures, and the people that supply the enslaved men, women, and children to the New World. We're going to talk about how African kingdoms and merchants were deeply entangled in the trade, sometimes as eager profiteers, sometimes as conflicted participants, and occasionally as resistors. Along the way, we're going to correct some of those common misconceptions, such as the notion that the Europeans greedily swept ashore and simply captured Africans at will. Instead, we'll see a more complicated reality emerge. Local African rulers negotiating with European buyers, local wars feeding the coastal slave markets, and a tragic cycle in which Africans both facilitated and suffered from the trade. We'll also see key regions and ports, from Senegambia and Elmina on the Gold Coast to Ouidah in West Africa and Luanda in Central Africa. And we'll talk about how African leaders and communities navigated the pressures and opportunities of the trade. And there'll be plenty of anecdotes from historical witnesses, drawing only on primary sources for these to bring this distant world to life. Certainly, by the end, you'll come out with a more nuanced understanding of how the transatlantic slave trade was not a one-sided European operation, but a system of exchange with deep African roots. All right, hello everyone. Introductions all out of the way. Allow me to welcome you to the channel. Perhaps it's your first time here, you've not clicked that subscribe button yet. Well, if you haven't, I invite you to do so. It's right next to the like button, conveniently, and you're welcome to leave your thoughts in the comments. This video is enjoyable completely ad-free on YouTube because of the generous contributions of those on Patreon and the YouTube memberships. Thank you also for checking out the merch store. Now, with introductions all out of the way, let's begin. The transatlantic slave trade. It had its beginnings in the mid-15th century, when European ships first reached coastal West Africa. At the time, African societies were already very familiar with slavery and slave trading, but on a much smaller scale. For instance, through trans-Saharan caravans that sent captives north, or through local wars where captives became slaves. But the arrival of the Portuguese in the 1440s introduced a new and voracious overseas demand. The Portuguese initially tried slave raiding, notably a 1444 expedition in Senegambia, but these forays were met with fierce resistance and ultimately proved to be less effective than trade. Coastal African rulers were soon willing to exchange captives, usually people from rival ethnic groups or war captives, for iron, textiles, firearms, any other goods that the Europeans brought. Indeed, it's been said that during the earliest years of the slave trade, the Portuguese generally preferred purchased Africans who had been enslaved during tribal wars, rather than taking the trouble of capturing them outright. And so, by the late 1400s, a steady trade was established. Enslaved Africans were being transported to work on sugar plantations in the Atlantic islands like Madeira, Sao Tome, and the Cape Verde Islands. Soon after 1500, with the European conquest of the Americas, the demand for labor was seeing a new boom. The Spanish began shipping enslaved Africans to the Caribbean as early as 1502. The Portuguese, operating from bases like Elmina on the Gold Coast, and later Sao Tome and Luanda in Angola, dominated the trade through the 16th century. During this period, African coastal kingdoms cooperated to supply slaves in exchange for valuable imports. For example, the Wolof Empire in Senegambia became a major supplier of slaves in the 1500s. It is estimated that as much as 1/3 of all enslaved Africans exported before 1600 came from the Senegambia region under Wolof influence. The Kingdom of Benin, that is, present-day Nigeria, also traded slaves with the Portuguese in the early 1500s, though notably Benin's obas, that is, kings, soon restricted slave exports, preferring to trade other goods like ivory and pepper. This is once they saw the destabilizing effects of the slave trade on their society. One illustrative early case is the Kingdom of Kongo in Central Africa. Kongo initially welcomed Portuguese contact in the late 15th century. Its king, Nzinga Nkuwu, converted to Christianity, and his son, Afonso, maintained close relations with Portugal. However, the Congolese soon grew alarmed at how the trade in captives was undermining their kingdom. In 1526, King Afonso I of Congo wrote a famous letter to the King of Portugal, pleading for an end to the uncontrolled slave trading. He lamented that Portuguese merchants were giving African traders so many enticing goods that the sons of this country are enslaved and kidnapped, even noblemen and the sons of noblemen, leading to the depopulation of his realm. Afonso complained that his authority was being undermined as unscrupulous people within Congo abducted others to sell to the Europeans for merchandise. He wrote, "So great, sir, is the corruption that our country is being completely depopulated." Now, this account shows that from early on, African leaders understood the disruptive impact of the slave trade. Despite Afonso's pleas and his attempt to ban the export of slaves from the Congo, the trade continued under less centralized conditions, often via rogue merchants and local chiefs beyond the king's control. Thus, by the end of the 16th century, the pattern was set. European buyers, anchored at coastal forts or on ships, relied on African suppliers to bring them captives from the interior. In these early centuries, the volume was still relatively small compared to what it would become, but the foundations of African involvement were laid. African elites had begun to see the trade as a source of wealth and European goods, while others already saw it as dangerous. This tension between the lure of profit and the peril to society would play out across Africa in the coming centuries as the transatlantic trade grew in scale. As the transatlantic slave trade entered its peak centuries, the 17th and 18th, its operations on African soil became more systematized. To understand the African slave markets, we must look at how captives were acquired, and how the markets were organized, and ultimately what was exchanged. The process typically began with a capture in the interior. Most enslaved Africans were seized in the context of local conflicts, wars between kingdoms, raids on neighboring villages, or punitive expeditions. African rulers and warlords recognized that prisoners of war could be sold for a decent profit. Some states even went to war primarily to secure captives for sale. For instance, the Kingdom of Dahomey in the 18th century notoriously conducted annual raids on its neighbors to capture men, women, and children who could be sold to the Europeans. Others, like the Asante Empire on the Gold Coast, fought wars of expansion that yielded prisoners who became a form of tribute or trade currency. In parts of equatorial Africa, bands of professional raiders, such as the Imbangala in Angola, roamed the countryside, kidnapping people and funneling them to coastal markets. After the capture, the captives were often marched in caravans toward the coast. Well, this could be a brutal journey, hundreds of miles. Many did not survive the trek due to hunger, disease, or abuse. On the way, captives might pass through inland slave markets or fairs, trading hubs where local dealers bought and sold humans. For example, in the Bight of Biafra hinterland, today's southeastern Nigeria and Cameroon, there were well-known slave fairs at places like Arochukwu and Uburu. The Aro merchants, an Igbo trading network, had established a quasi-monopoly over the interior trade. They operated under the aegis of a famous oracle, the shrine at Chukwu at Arochukwu, using religion to sanction the enslavement of those accused of crimes or witchcraft. Through this system, the Aro Confederacy funneled tens of thousands of Igbo and other nations from the interior to the coast. In his memoir, Oluwadu Equiano, an Igbo child who was kidnapped around 1753, described being seized by African kidnappers while his parents were away in the fields, and then being sold from one African owner to another over months until finally he reached the coast. His account shows that from the point of capture to the point of sale, to Europeans that is, an enslaved African might change hands multiple times within Africa. Once the caravans reached the coast, they entered the coastal slave markets. These markets took different forms depending on the region. In some places, they were fortified trading posts, often called slave castles, operated by Europeans in partnership with local authorities. For instance, the Elmina Castle on the Gold Coast, or the Gore Island in Senegambia. At such forts, European factors, or agents, would inspect and purchase captives delivered by African brokers. In other regions, there were open beach markets or trading towns, where European ships anchored offshore and African traders came out to meet them. The Bight of Biafra coast worked in this manner. Europeans didn't build any forts, but they anchored their ships in places like Old Calabar or Bonny, and negotiated with local merchant princes. We have a vivid description of an African slave market that comes from Willem Bosman, a Dutch trader on the Guinea coast. Around 1700, Bosman wrote that Ouidah or Ouidah markets are of men here kept in the same manner as those of beasts are with us, meaning that enslaved people were openly bartered and examined like cattle in the marketplace. This blunt observation, from a participant's perspective, highlights the commodification of humans in these transactions. The actual exchange was driven by economic incentive on both sides. Europeans offered guns, gunpowder, textiles, metal bars, alcohol, and other trades goods as currency. In return, Africans sold Africans. Prices fluctuated with supply and demand. There was also a system of credit and trust in operation. European captains, anxious to fill their ships quickly, would often advance goods to the African suppliers, essentially giving goods on credit, with the promise that the local trader would deliver a certain number of slaves in the coming weeks or months. But this was risky, so to secure the deal, Africans and Europeans developed a practice called pawnship. One side would hand over a pawn, a person, as collateral, sometimes a relative of the African trader, or in other cases, a European crewman left in the African trader's custody, to guarantee the debt, either slaves or goods owed, would be repaid. Duke, an Efik merchant of old Calabar, noted in his diary in the 1780s how such pawning was used to enforce honest dealing on both sides. Another important aspect was the African control of commercial protocol. Coastal African leaders often imposed customs duties and regulations on Europeans. In the kingdom of Dahomey, for instance, the king claimed a royal monopoly on slave trading. All sales in Ouidah had to go through the king's agents, through private merchants still operated under his system. In Old Calabar, the local chiefs, like Duke's family, charged European slave ships a trading fee called Dahomey before any business could take place. They demanded that visiting captains pay proper gifts and obey local rules. If a European captain tried to bypass these rules or cheat the Africans, trade could be cut off. Indeed, offending captains were sometimes forced to depart empty-handed. Thus, far from Europeans simply dictating terms, the African side had set up its own structure to govern the trade. At the coast, captives were typically held in barracoons or compounds while awaiting shipment. In European forts like Elmina or Cape Coast Castle, dungeon-like holding cells warehoused hundreds of captives at a time. At ports controlled by African authorities, the captives might be kept in stockades or the houses of traders until the moment of embarkation. When a slave ship was ready to load, final negotiations took place, often involving inspection of the captives by the European buyers. The enslaved, tragically, were treated like merchandise, examined for health and strength, sometimes branded with hot irons to mark a buyer's ownership. Once a private price was settled and the payment in goods complete, the captives were conveyed in small boats or canoes out to the waiting ship. Many African observers watched those ships depart over the horizon, knowing they carried sons, daughters, or former neighbors, and understanding that those people would likely never return. So, the mechanics of the slave trade, to sum it up, on the African side involved a chain of African participants, raiders or soldiers who captured people, middlemen who transported and sold them, and local merchants and chiefs who negotiated with the European ship captains. European traders usually remained at the periphery, on board ships or inside coastal forts, while African networks brought the human cargo to them. African political and economic systems thus shaped the trade at every turn. With this general framework in mind, let's use it to examine several major African regions and ports in a little bit more detail. And we'll see how these dynamics played out differently across different parts of the continent. So let's start with the Senegambia region. It was the first among those areas linked with the transatlantic slave trade. So we're talking around the Senegal and Gambia rivers. That's where they get the name from. Quite clever. Portuguese ships reached this coast in the mid-15th century, and by the 1500s, the trade was well established. Coastal kingdoms such as Wolof and Kayor and others engaged in commerce with the Europeans. In the 16th century, Wolof was a powerful empire. It became a major supplier of enslaved people, especially after the collapse of older Mali Empire's influence in the region. African merchants and rulers in Senegambia traded slaves for horses, highly valued in that area, cloth too, and other goods. Some captives were people who had been slaves within Africa, for example, pawns or those sold for debt, while others were war captives from conflicts between local states. But significantly, not all in Senegambia acquiesced to the trade. There are accounts of local resistance. For instance, the Jola people of Casamance and certain other communities largely refused to participate, sometimes moving their villagers to more defensible locations to avoid slave raids. In the late 18th century, an important anti-slave trader stance emerged in Senegambia under a Muslim leader named Abdul Kader Ghane, the Almami of Futa Toro, a theocratic Fulani state along the middle Senegal River. In 1787, the Almami Abdul Kader forbade the passage of any slaves through Futa Toro for sale to Europeans. At the time, several French slaving ships were waiting at the mouth of the Senegal River, only to find that the caravans of captives were no longer coming. Ghane declared that no one in his realm, no Muslim, could be sold into slavery, effectively cutting off a major supply route. The French, frustrated in their business, even sent gifts to persuade him to relent, but he held firm. This early abolitionist measure is a striking example of an African leader taking a moral and political stand against the slave trade, even as neighboring rulers continued to sell captives. Meanwhile, European presence in Senegambia remained limited to coastal enclaves. In the island of Gorée, just off Dakar, and St. Louis at the mouth of the Senegal were key slaving trade ports, changing hands between the Portuguese, Dutch, French, and English over time. Through such African-European partnership, the trade in the Senegambia persisted into the 18th century. By the 19th century, however, it declined as France began to shift the region's economy toward legitimate commerce, that is, peanuts, gum arabic, as European anti-slave trade patrols increased. Senegambia's experience highlights that at the very gateway of Atlantic Africa, the slave trade was both enabled by African polities and, in pockets, actively resisted by them. Moving eastward along the Guinea coast, the region known as the Gold Coast, modern Ghana, had a long history of contact with Europeans, initially focused on gold, hence the name, but later increasingly on slaves. The Portuguese built Elmina Castle there in 1482, originally to secure access to gold fields. For over a century, gold was the primary export. By the 17th century, however, the dynamic had shifted. The Dutch seized Elmina in 1637 and expanded the castle's dungeons to hold slaves as the transatlantic demand grew. Numerous other European forts and trading lodges soon dotted the coastline. Cape Coast Castle, British, Fort Amsterdam, Anamabu, and more, creating a highly competitive environment under the watchful eyes of African authorities inland. On the African side, the Akan peoples dominated commerce in the Gold Coast. In the interior, the Ashanti Empire rose to prominence in the late 17th century, conquering neighboring Akan states and gaining control over lucrative gold-producing areas. The Ashanti Empire's economy was not singularly dependent on slave exports. It was also built on gold and the kola nut trade. But warfare was integral to their expansion, and war captives were frequently sold to the coast. One British visitor to Kumasi, the Ashanti capital, in the early 19th century, recorded the Ashanti king Osei Bonsu's candid rationale for trading slaves. The king reportedly explained that if he did not sell his war captives to the Europeans, he would have to kill them, as retaining large numbers of enemy prisoners could destabilize the kingdom. Well, an anecdote like that shows how African leaders rationalize their participation. Far better to sell them off than to send them off to the next world. Now, on the coast itself, African merchant brokers played their own role. The Fante people, who lived in the coastal littoral below Ashanti, often acted as intermediaries. They formed a network of brokers, sometimes called kabukiers, who bought slaves and other goods from the interior to the European forts. Fante coastal towns such as Anamabu and Cape Coast thus became thriving commercial centers. Europeans could not simply march inland to Ashanti. They relied on African allies and trading partners to maintain the flow of goods and people. The relationship between the Fante and Ashanti was complex. They were trading partners, but also rivals, and they fought wars in the 18th century, in part over control of these trade routes. Elmina and other forts functioned as the terminus of these supply lines. By the 18th century, Elmina Castle was dispatching immense numbers of captives annually. One estimate holds that by that time, about 30,000 enslaved people per year passed through Elmina's dungeons on their way to the Americas. Most of these individuals had been collected from a wide hinterland extending north and west. European records from these forts speak of slave caravans arriving, sometimes hundreds at once, often in miserable condition after long treks. They also described haggling with local brokers, payment of customs to local chiefs, and occasional breakdowns in trade due to African political changes. For example, if a local king died or if a war cut off a supply route, European forts might sit idle for months, and of course, time is money. Now, it is worth noting that the Gold Coast had a highly regulated trade environment. The presence of multiple European forts meant African sellers could in some sense shop around for the best deals, playing one European nation off against another. Conversely, Europeans sometimes coordinated to try to stabilize prices. But ultimately, African suppliers had the upper hand in dictating when and how the trade would occur. If there was a shortage of captives, say during a lull in local wars, European buyers simply had to wait or sail elsewhere. The power of the Asante was formidable. In 1824, an Ashanti army even descended to the coast and defeated a British force near Cape Coast in a dispute over trade, demonstrating that African states could indeed challenge the Europeans militarily if they were provoked. The story of the Gold Coast, therefore, is one of a prosperous African region whose leaders, especially in the Asante kings, integrated the African slave trade into their political economy, but always on the terms shaped by African politics. In fact, even today, Elmina Castle is still there, a stark monument to this human commerce. Continuing along West Africa, we come to the Bight of Benin, known to the European merchants of the 18th century as the Slave Coast, due to the vast numbers of captives shipped from its harbors. Not the best name, I suppose, but certainly shows the situation. It was here that a patchwork of kingdoms and city-states vied for control of the trade. In the 17th century, the coastal kingdom of Alada and the port of Ouidah were prominent suppliers. However, there was a dramatic power shift that occurred in the early 18th century, when the inland kingdom of Dahomey rose to dominance under King Agaja. In 1727, Dahomey's armies conquered Ouidah, taking its thriving slave ports. Thereafter, Dahomey became one of the most notorious slave-trading states in Africa. At its height, Dahomey had a highly militarized society, geared towards slave raiding and trading. The Dahomeyan kings built a standing army, which included the famous female warriors often called the Dahomey Amazons, that conducted frequent raids on neighboring peoples. Captives from these campaigns were marched to the Dahomey capital of Abomey, or directly to Ouidah on the coast. Some captives were kept for local use. Dahomey maintained a large population of domestic slaves and also practiced human sacrifice of war prisoners during the kingdom's annual customs ritual. But the majority were still sold to the Europeans at the coast. The monarchy established a royal monopoly. European traders could only buy slaves through the king's appointed agents, and they paid customs duties and offered tribute to the king for the privilege. In Ouidah, multiple European nations maintained trading lodges or small forts. The French, English, Portuguese, Brazilians, they all had a presence, but they operated at Dahomey's sufferance. One European visitor in the 1770s noted that the king of Dahomey set the terms and could halt a trade on a whim. In effect, European factors had to negotiate with powerful African officials, always on the king's terms. Ouidah itself was one of the busiest slave ports in the world during the 18th century. Historians estimate that over the slave trade era, more than 1 million Africans were sent from Ouidah across the Atlantic, second only to Luanda, Angola, in volume. Most went to Brazil and the Caribbean. The city was cosmopolitan in its own way, a mix of local Dahomeyan people and other Africans from the interior, along with European traders, Afro-Brazilian returnees who served as middlemen. Yet Europeans in Ouidah never numbered more than a few hundred at a time. The bulk of commerce was conducted by African merchants under Dahomey's authority. A notable figure was Francisco Felix de Souza, a Brazilian-born trader who became the Dahomey king's chief commercial agent in Ouidah in the early 19th century, illustrating how even foreign traders had to be sanctioned and integrated into the Dahomeyan system. But the kings of Dahomey they grew wealthy and formidable through the sale of human beings. King Gezo, who ruled from 1818 to 1858, famously resisted British pressures to abolish the trade. He is quoted as saying in the 1840s, "The slave trade is the ruling principle of my people. It is the source and the glory of their wealth. The mother lulls the child to sleep with notes of triumph over an enemy reduced to slavery." Well, that's a hell of a declaration, isn't it? But it lays bare how deeply the slave trade had become embedded in their economy and ideology. It was the kingdom's lifeblood. Even when Britain and France began suppressing the Atlantic slave trade in the early and mid-19th century, Dahomey continued it for years. Only in the 1850s, after the British naval blockades and growth of alternative exports like palm oil, did Dahomey finally begin to redirect its economy. East of Dahomey, the Yoruba Empire of Oyo likewise supplied slaves from its wars until it collapsed in the early 19th century. Thereafter, chaotic conflicts in Yoruba land fed the trade through ports like Lagos, until the British annexed Lagos in 1851 to suppress it. So in summary, the Slave Coast exemplified a region where African state power was heavily leveraged to maximize the slave trade. From the kings of Dahomey, who orchestrated raids and dictated terms to European buyers, to the shifting fortunes of Yoruba realms further east, the Bight of Benin slave markets were fundamentally shaped by African political ambition and rivalry. The grim calculus of exchanging guns for slaves played out here in especially stark terms. Dahomey and its peers imported large quantities of firearms and gunpowder, and they used that to capture even more slaves, and they used the slaves to purchase even more firearms and gunpowder, and they used that to, well, I don't have to go on, but it's a destructive feedback loop. Violence and commerce, devastating countless communities, and destroying innumerable families. Further east, on the Atlantic coast, lies the Bight of Biafra, encompassing parts of modern Nigeria, like the Niger Delta and the Cross River region, and western Cameroon. Unlike the Gold Coast or the Slave Coast, this area didn't have a large central kingdom dominating the trade. You see, it was characterized by powerful merchant networks and small coastal states. As I've mentioned, the interior supply was largely controlled by the Aro Confederacy, an alliance of Igbo traders and priests centered on Arochukwu. The Aro network fed captives from a wide hinterland into the Delta ports. They used the authority of their oracle to justify enslaving people. For example, individuals condemned by the shrine for alleged crimes of witchcraft might be sold off as slaves, ostensibly as a form of divine judgment or divine sanction. Through such means, the Aro amassed enormous influence over the slave trade in this region. On the coast, the key outlets were the Delta city-states of Bonny, Old Calabar, Brass, and New Calabar. These were not empires, but each was ruled by its own king or council of chiefs, often themselves wealthy slave traders. They became extremely active middlemen between the Aro interior networks and the European ships. For instance, at Old Calabar, also called Duketown, a handful of Efik aristocratic families, with surnames like Duke, Eyamba, and Henshaw, dominated the trade. Antera Duke, whose diary provides a rare African perspective on the trade, was one such merchant prince. He and his peers ran what amounted to a slave-dealing houses in Calabar, complete with agents upriver, and established partnerships with British captains. When English slave ships arrived at the Cross River estuary, the Calabar chiefs would negotiate the price, enforce the collection of debts or the payment of Dahomey, and even hold British crew members hostage as pawns if trust broke down. A striking aspect of the Bight of Biafra trade is that Europeans did not establish permanent forts or colonies in this stretch of coast. They didn't need to. The African trading communities were well organized, and they provided every service, including marshalling slaves and provisioning the ships. European captives anchored offshore, and African brokers came out to meet them in large canoes, bringing samples of trade goods and bargaining over prices. The volume of exports from this region was enormous. The Bight of Biafra became the third largest source of African slaves of the Americas, after West Central Africa and the Bight of Benin during the 18th century. Many of these captives were Igbo or Ibibio from the hinterland. They were dispersed mainly to British Caribbean or North America, which is one reason why that even today a significant portion of African Americans have genetic heritage traced to this region. The dynamics here were marked by decentralized violence. The absence of a unifying empire meant that a myriad of micro-level conflicts and kidnappings fed the trade. Oral histories in Igbo communities still recount how people feared the threat of kidnappers or the manipulations of arrow agents. It is said that some villagers planted spiked barriers or moved their markets to thwart slave raiders. The social fabric was severely strained by these disruptions. Still, a few African communities in the region found ways to protect themselves. The inland town, for example, of Abeokuta, in today's Ogun State, Nigeria, was founded in the 1820s by refugees from various Yoruba and other communities fleeing the slave raids, and that includes some repatriated slaves returning from Sierra Leone. Abeokuta grew into a formidable fortified city, and notably defeated Dahomey's invading army in 1851, becoming a kind of safe haven, a promised land, away from the coastal slave trade. The Bight of Biafra's slave trade functioned through African merchant entrepreneurship, rather than a large state apparatus, which is what made it different. African agents here were consummate traders. The Aro chieftains and the Delta kings alike profited by orchestrating the capture, transport, and sale of human beings, all while negotiating shrewdly with European buyers. Activities like this highlight yet another facet of African involvement. Not empire builders like Dahomey, but networks of merchants who turned the misery of others into wealth, operating a devastating commerce that preyed on the fragmentation of their region. But of course, no account of the African side of the slave trade would be complete without West Central Africa, the single largest source of captives sent across the Atlantic. This broad region, covering today's Angola, Republic of the Congo, Democratic Republic of the Congo, and surrounding areas, supplied nearly half of all enslaved Africans transported to the Americas. The trade here began early and lasted the longest. The Portuguese established a permanent foothold in the kingdom of Ndongo, present-day Angola, in the late 1500s, founding the port city of Luanda in 1575. By the 17th century, Luanda had grown into the busiest slave port in Africa. sending tens of thousands of people each year to Portuguese colonies, especially Brazil. Along with Luanda, the port of Benguela, further south on the Angolan coast, founded in 1617, became another major slaving outlet. African political organization in this region was complex and in flux. The Kingdom of Kongo to the north had been a centralized state since the 1400s and initially engaged with the Portuguese on relatively equal terms. But as the slave trade grew, Kongo was destabilized. After King Afonso's attempts to control the trade in the 1520s, as we discussed earlier, failed, Kongo gradually fell into civil wars. Many of these conflicts were stoked by competing factions trying to capture and sell slaves to the Portuguese. In 1665, the Congolese king was even killed in a battle against the Portuguese, and the once mighty kingdom fragmented into smaller realms. But of course, the slave business had to continue. Further south, the Portuguese fought lengthy wars with the kingdom of Ndongo and its allies. A legendary figure, Queen Nzinga of Ndongo and later Matamba, led a determined resistance against the Portuguese in the 1620s to 50s, at times even allying with the Dutch to counter the Portuguese power. Nzinga turned her inland territory into a refuge for those fleeing the Portuguese and Imbangala raids. Yet after her death, Portuguese expansion resumed. The Portuguese often allied with brutal bands of mercenaries known as the Imbangala, whose way of life was raiding and warfare. The Imbangala in the 1600s became the main suppliers of slaves to the Portuguese in Angola. Armed with European guns and driven by a violent warrior culture, they wreaked havoc, capturing huge numbers of people. The phrase itself, Imbangala, became synonymous with terror in the region. By the 18th century, the slave system in West Central Africa was highly organized and deeply entrenched. The Portuguese authorities in Luanda and Benguela worked with mixed-race Afro-Portuguese traders and certain African chiefs to funnel slaves out from the interior. There were established routes and markets in the interior, sometimes called slave fairs, at places like Kasanje on the upper Kwanza River, where African brokers exchanged captives for Portuguese goods under agreed rules. The Portuguese government even set up a trading board, junta, in Luanda to oversee the trade and regulate prices at these markets. Nevertheless, chaos and violence remained endemic. Entire districts in the interior were depopulated by constant raiding, with ruined villages and abandoned fields left as grim evidence. Luanda maintained its position as arguably the largest slave exporting port in Africa. In the 18th century, it was often called the emporium of the slave trade. In one period, 1700 to 1850, nearly 1.5 million people were embarked on slave ships from Luanda and Benguela alone. The vast majority were sent to the Portuguese colony of Brazil, with which Angola had special trading relationships. Indeed, Angolan and Brazilian ports were so connected that some historians speak of a South Atlantic system, centered mainly around the Portuguese colonies. Enslaved Africans from this region were predominantly from groups such as the Mbundu, the Bakongo, of Mbundu, and others drawn from the deep interior by the 19th century. Many ended up on Brazilian sugar and coffee plantations. Some were also taken to the Caribbean, and North America via Spanish and French traders. Even as this mass export continued, African societies in West Central Africa adapted and resisted in various ways. Some inland polities, like the Lunda Empire in the southeast, or the Chokwe or Ovimbundu kingdoms, rose to prominence by controlling trade routes, or offering some refuge from slavers, while also inevitably becoming involved in the commerce themselves. Chiefs in the interior negotiated terms with Portuguese traders, sometimes demanding high prices, or European titles and favors in exchange for cooperation. But overall, the balance of power in this region, unlike in parts of West Africa, increasingly tilted toward the European side by the 19th century. Portugal had established Angola as a colony, and didn't hesitate to use military force against African rulers who impeded the trade. West Central Africa thus presents a picture where the African agency was present, but under extreme duress from direct colonial intrusion. The Portuguese and their allies deliberately fomented conflict to produce captives, and local opportunists took advantage of the lucrative market. Still, without the cooperation of African middlemen, the chiefs who struck deals, the Imbangala who captured slaves, the Afro-Portuguese who could traverse the interior, even the Portuguese could not have sustained the trade at such a volume. A grim partnership of convenience, one that wrecked the demographics and stability of the region for generations. And so, the story of Africa's slave markets during the transatlantic slave trade is a sobering lesson in historical complexity. It demonstrates that the tragedy of the Atlantic slave trade was not the work of one continent alone, but a collaboration that spanned cultures. European slave traders provided the ships, the demand for plantation labor, and the capital. African kings, merchants, and warlords provided the supply of human beings, exploiting internal conflicts and social systems for gain. Without African participation, the slave trade couldn't have grown so immense, and without European and American demand, it would not have arisen as much as it did. By examining the slave markets from Senegambia to Angola, we see agency and decision-making on the African side. Some leaders profited, expanded their realms, while others resisted or fell victim to the trade's disruptions. And we also correct, and very much so, that very simplistic misconception that Europeans alone were responsible for capturing Africans. In reality, the Middle Passage was just the final step of a long journey that often began with an African raid or judicial enslavement. We have to recognize that this nuance does not excuse any of the horrors of the trade, but it rather makes the tragedy more poignant by showing how both Africans were victims and participants. The slave trade was sustained by greed and violence in multiple societies, and its legacy is devastating. Entire regions depopulated or destabilized by the export of millions of people. And so we're left to wonder how African history might have unfolded has these human energies not been siphoned away. And that's a haunting question. Ultimately, the story that we've told today is not the story of one culture or one race oppressing another. It's the tale as old as time, the powerful taking the powerless and exploiting them. It's not that complicated. And, well, unfortunately, that's perhaps a trend that will continue. By the time we realize it, it usually looks a lot worse in hindsight. Now, thank you for joining me. I hope you've learned something. I'm sure you have, unless you're asleep by now. Perhaps you'll go to sleep now, or perhaps you'll watch another video. I don't know what you'll do. Feel free to watch another video, though. It's your choice. Let me thank the top-tier patrons and supporters. Dark, Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Ember, Susan, Cameron, Legitmus, Kerry, Charlene, Lynn Therese, Katiana, Nicholas Ulfadnir, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuro Nerd, Erin, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Scott, Stark Factory, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stefan, Kevin, HMSHH, Crystal, Talbury, Anthony, Lucy, Brandon, and Goo Goo Boo Barneck. Okay, that's it from me. Guys, we reached the end of another video. Perhaps you have a lot to think about. And next time somebody hits you with those old misconceptions, you can know it, and you can tell them about those African markets. Last time I made a video about slavery, and any time I make a video about slavery in the United States, there's always a lot of geniuses in the comments who want to remind me that, white people were slaves too, and it wasn't just the Europeans who were doing it. Well, guess what? I know. Everyone knows. Everyone who's opened a book realizes this. So part of making this video is to clear some of those misconceptions up. Anyway, let's hope we don't have any more geniuses in the comments with their outlandish theories. Thank you very much for listening. It's been a pleasure. And lots of love to you all, as always. Good night.